Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to try and answer a huge question. Why did Europe plunge into the First World War? We're going to rewind to 1910, a time of incredible optimism, to see how a continent so sure of its own genius ended up building a machine of total catastrophe. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the paradox of that moment. You see, on the surface, everything looked great. Europe was at its absolute peak. But underneath it all, the very systems they built to keep the peace were, without anyone really noticing, being wired for self-destruction. So our story really kicks off around 1910 in the capital cities of Europe's five great powers. Everyone was brimming with confidence, but each one was also nursing its own unique and pretty dangerous delusion. Let's do a quick tour. So, first up, Vienna. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was this huge, sprawling, multi-ethnic thing, kind of like a sleeper who has no idea their bed is on fire. It was run by this massive bureaucracy that got so caught up in procedures and paperwork that they forgot the whole point. They were just keeping the old machine running because they were terrified of what might happen if it ever stopped. Okay, now let's jump over to Berlin. The German Empire was the new kid on the block. Super powerful, but also deeply insecure. And it funneled all that energy and ambition into planning, meticulous, systematic planning. The German generals got so obsessed with efficiency, they basically turned the absolute nightmare of a modern war into a simple problem of railroad timetables. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, you've got London. They're overseeing this massive global empire, the biggest the world had ever seen. And this gave Britain this feeling of, splendid isolation. They looked at all the trouble brewing on the continent with a sort of detached sympathy, like a guy watching other people get soaked in the rain while he's perfectly dry indoors. And Paris, well, Paris was the cultural capital of the entire world, but politically it was a mess. The government was in what you could call a state of normal, permanent crisis. The whole nation was basically haunted by that humiliating defeat to Germany back in 1870, and that trauma created this deep, burning desire to get back the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine. And finally, we land in St. Petersburg. The Russian Empire was just a land of massive contradictions, staggering along under an all-powerful czar. And here's the crazy part. This absolute monarchy was allied with the Democratic Republic of France. It was a partnership that, really only made sense for one single reason. They both saw Germany as a huge threat. So, that's the setup. The first major gear in this war machine was the military. The generals across Europe were absolutely convinced of one thing. The next war would be won by whoever attacked first and hardest. This blind faith in the offense shaped everything they did. And what's so fascinating here is the contrast. On one side, you have Germany's Schlieffen Plan. It was this cold, calculated masterpiece of logistics. And on the other, you have France's Plan 17. Which was based on this almost spiritual belief in élan, the fighting spirit of the French soldier. They were both brilliant in their own ways, and they were both totally, catastrophically disconnected from the reality of machine guns and modern artillery. You see, the Schlieffen Plan wasn't just a strategy, it was a straitjacket. It was all about speed. The second mobilization started, this whole sequence was locked in. It meant that any crisis with Russia would automatically trigger a full-scale war with France. And its very first step, invading neutral Belgium, pretty much guaranteed that Britain would have to get involved. And this number right here, 25, it just perfectly sums up the aggressive mindset of the time. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian chief of staff officially recommended a preventive war, just going ahead and starting one, a staggering 25 times in the 6 years before 1914. For these guys, it wasn't a question of if there would be a war, but when. Okay, so that's the military thinking. The next piece of the machine is the diplomacy. The whole system of alliances was supposed to keep the peace, but it ended up creating this inescapable trap. So how did this happen? How did a bunch of alliances that were all technically for defense end up guaranteeing a continent-wide war? Well, the problem was that Europe had split into these two rigid armed camps. They created a chain reaction that made a small local conflict basically impossible. So instead of preventing a war, it basically set up a line of dominoes. Think about it. If Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, then Russia has to defend Serbia. But if Russia mobilizes, Germany has to back Austria and launch its Schlieffen Plan against France. And then France, of course, is bound to help Russia. All of a sudden, a little crisis in the Balkans becomes a world war. All right, so we've got rigid military plans, and we've got these diplomatic tripwires. Now let's add the final component that locked the whole machine into place: public opinion. For the first time ever, what ordinary people thought about foreign policy really mattered. You see, all across Europe, this new wave of intense nationalism, fanned by the new mass circulation newspapers, was changing the whole game. Diplomacy wasn't some quiet game played by elites anymore. Now, every single international crisis was blown up into a huge test of national honor. For any politician, trying to compromise was seen as being weak. Backing down was pretty much political suicide. So here's the crucial point. You take these three things, the rigid military plans, the interlocking alliances, and this intense public pressure, and they all snap together. They created this unstoppable momentum, a machine that once you turned it on, you just couldn't turn off. And that's the real tragedy of 1914. This war wasn't caused by a bunch of evil villains or blithering idiots. It was caused by intelligent, capable, patriotic leaders, all of them doing their jobs and making what they thought were rational decisions. The problem wasn't the people, it was the system itself, a system whose own internal logic pointed in only one direction, toward destruction. So in the end, the leaders of 1914 found out the hard way that they weren't the ones running the great machine of civilization. No, they were just cogs inside it. The very systems they had built to keep themselves safe had taken on a life of their own and were now driving them toward a catastrophe that nobody really wanted. And that leaves us with a final, pretty chilling question, one that's just as relevant for us today. How do we even recognize when the complex systems we build, whether they're technological, economic, or political, start to develop their own logic and begin leading us somewhere we never, ever intended to go?